Just want to welcome you all as you're coming in. I'm Shannon Clifford, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mesa Verde Foundation, and we are honored to have you here today. We like to make this fun and keep you engaged. So if you want to start off while we've got a few minutes here, looking at our beautiful photos from the park, and then also sharing where you're joining us from. We always love to see where people are coming from, and we have registrants from all across the nation. So if you don't mind sharing and just dropping a little line in the chat about where you're from, we will be starting the webinar promptly at 4 o'clock. But in the meantime, please enjoy the slides that you're seeing now, and feel free to drop us a line in the chat box. Again, welcome. Thank you all for joining. People are slowly coming in from the waiting room. So we are just sharing some photos of the park. Please enjoy the slideshow. And if you feel like you want to drop a line in the chat box about where you're joining us from, we always love to have that information. This is a great group from all across the United States, and it's kind of fun just to share. Thanks very much. We'll get started promptly at 4 o'clock. Again, please enjoy the slides while we're waiting for everyone to join. We have a few people coming in, but we will get started promptly at 4 o'clock. In the meantime, if you'd like to share where you're joining us from, we would love to have that in the chat box. Thanks so much. All right, just one more minute until we begin. In the meantime, thanks again for joining us. My name is Shannon Clifford, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mesa Verde Foundation, and we are honored to have you joining us today for this fabulous webinar. While we're waiting for another 30 seconds or so, please feel free to drop a line in the chat box that tells us where you're joining us from. We would love to have that information. We have people who register all from across the United States, so we always love to hear where people are joining us from. We've got just a couple of seconds here, and then we will get started. In the meantime, enjoy these beautiful photos of the park. Okay, so my watch says it's 4 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. People will, of course, be joining us as the hour progresses. But in the meantime, thanks again for being here. And I'm just going to hand it over to Monica Buckle, who is leading us through this fabulous webinar. Thanks, Monica.
Well, thank you, Shannon, and good afternoon and happy summer, everyone. Thank you for joining the Mesa Verde Foundation. I serve on the Foundation's Board of Directors, and I'll be moderating today's event. Normally, I have a fabulous scene of Mesa Verde behind me, but I'm traveling, and currently I'm in Sedona, Arizona, so I apologize for the blank wall and not having some fabulous view of the park. Anyhow, we are most privileged to have Christine McAllister presenting. Christine is a Mesa Verde National Park archaeologist. Christine will discuss the large fires that have consumed approximately half of the park's acreage over the past 25 years and the cultural resources staff response during and after the fires to protect the park's many prehistoric and historic resources. Christine will explain how archaeological sites are recorded and assessed for fire effects and suppression impacts after a fire, as well as what types of treatments are recommended and installed to mitigate that damage. The Mesa Verde Foundation is the official philanthropic nonprofit partner to Mesa Verde National Park. As a foundation, we secure funding for the park's capital improvements, special projects, and further promote understanding and preservation for ancestral Puebloan culture. The Mesa Verde Foundation is also pleased to announce that we have launched a legacy society to recognize and honor those who have included a gift to the foundation in their estate plans. A planned gift is an investment in continuing the legacy of Mesa Verde National Park and the people who occupied its incredible dwellings. For more information about the Legacy Society, please contact our Executive Director, Shannon Clifford, at the email in the chat box. We still have a few spots left on our upcoming fall tour this October. The Foundation is hosting a 4-day, 3-night, behind-the-scenes VIP tour at the park. Conducting the tour is Dr. Gilliford, Professor of History and Environmental Science at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado, and a Mesa Verde Foundation board member. Dr. Gilliford will be joined by the renowned Zuni basket maker, Christopher Lewis. As a group, we will explore Mesa Verde, speak to park specialists, and even have time with Dr. Tara Travis at the Parks Museum, and have access to view the jewelry that was donated by Mary Coulter. For those who tuned in last month's webinar, Dr. Tara Travis spoke of the Mary Coulter collection. Tour information and registration is in the chat box. I would like to thank the park superintendent, Cliff Spencer, for his support throughout the years and his immense contributions he has made to Mesa Verde National Park. Our public programming is possible solely from donations and the support of Mesa Verde Foundation fellows and members like you. We thank you for creating space for this webinar offering. Now, circling back to our guest speaker, Christine has been an archaeologist at Mesa Verde National Park since 1999. She has directed numerous archaeological surveys and documentation projects in the park. She has over 25 years of field experience on both private and public land, including survey, excavation, analysis, and cultural resource management. During her time at Mesa Verde, Christine has conducted site condition assessment, architectural documentation, post-fire assessment, and treatments. She has also worked as a fire archaeologist and resource advisor during wildland fires. Christine holds a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology from Marquette University. She has co-authored a number of professional reports and presentations on the archaeology and architecture of Mesa Verde. Since 2018, she has worked on the North Abydos excavations team in Egypt, co-directed by New York University's Institute of Fine Arts and Princeton University. We'll be happy to take questions at the end of the presentation. If you could kindly hold them, that would be most appreciated. I'd like to now welcome Christine. Christine, welcome.
All right. Thank you, Monica and Shannon. It's good to be here. I'm presenting from Mesa Verde, where we've had a bit of rain today. It's been really nice.
Well, we almost got washed away in Sedona yesterday, but as you said, it's nice to see rain, especially during wildfire season. So, you know, everyone's tuned in to listen to you. So without further ado, please, Christine, take it away.
Okay. Oops. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Oops. Hold on. I just had to get to the right tab here. All righty. Now we should be there. Can you all see that?
Yes, Christine, I see you and I see the PowerPoint now. I just would love if you could do full screen. Okay. Perfect. Beautiful.
All right, we got it.
Yes.
All right, so I'll be talking about the fires, the large fires we've had in the park, and the role that the archaeologists play here, both before, during, and after a fire. Right here, you can see the Long Mesa fire, which happened in 2002. And that fire burned over the headquarters area of the park, where our cultural resource offices are, and a lot of the area where our large cliff dwellings are located on Chapin Mesa. Here I've just got some pictures of some of the mitigation measures we take during the fire, water and retardant drops, and we'll be talking about the impacts to sites that those can cause later. Here's a map of all of our archaeological sites in the park. Each dot represents a site, and they run a gamut of time periods from Archaic time period up through Pueblo III. We have over 4,600 known sites in the park right now, and out of these we have about 600 cliff dwelling sites. We have many different types of sites, both prehistoric and historic in the park. We have the remains of habitations. We also have water control features, kivas, pit houses, rock modifications. You're all familiar with petroglyphs and pictographs. We also have things like grinding slicks and pecked basins. We've got hand and toehold trails. We have hearths, we have kilns for manufacturing pottery. We have more specialized and isolated features like towers that are on their own, shrines. We have reservoirs, we have historic sites from early exploration in the park, early tourism. We've got foundations and artifacts, remains of campsites, all kinds of things. And any or all of these could be affected in a fire. So here's some examples of what structural remains can look like on the ground after walls have collapsed. You're looking in the upper left at a rubble mound, which used to be a standing block of rooms, masonry rooms, and then there's a kiva depression there in the middle. And then the bottom picture shows some partially standing architecture. Here are some more examples of sites. These are some check dams that were burned over just a couple of years ago. Up in the upper left there, you got the remains of a tower. And here are some grinding slick features. They're sometimes also called axe sharpening grooves. These kind of depressions are worn into the rock by repeated use of a mano, grinding, usually food or pigments. They can also be used to sharpen tools, which is why sometimes they're called axe grooves. And you can see how that sandstone spalls during a high fire event. Here's an example of what some of our Navajo sites look like. We've got lean-tos, wickiups, sweat lodges, which have a pile of burned rock, usually to the side, as you see in that picture. And then you tend to have a can scatter along with that. We had quite a few Navajos working in the park too in the last century. And so we've got Navajo hogans as well. All right, this slide shows our fire history map. We have had quite a few big fires over the last 25 years, and I've got them listed here along with the dates and the acreage. The fire that happened in 1996, the Chapin 5 fire up there in the upper left, that was almost 5,000 acres. And the last year of the post-fire work that was being done on that fire, 1999, is when I came to work here. And so I've been here for the other fires. The Bircher fire was our biggest one at over 23,000 acres, and that one had over 19,000 acres of park land that burned. And then some of the fire was on adjacent lands. And just a couple of weeks after that fire broke out, we had the Pony Fire, which was over 5,000 acres out on Wetherill Mesa. The Long Mesa fire was a fire that happened in 2002. That's the one I showed you that took place here on Chapin Mesa, and it's very visible even today, almost 20 years later, as you drive into the park. You see quite a bit of burn, pinyon, and juniper. Those trees don't really come back very easily and may not come back in parts of our park. Two most recent fires are listed in the upper right, the Moccasin Mesa fire in 2018 and the Moorfield fire in 2020, and I'm going to have some slides of those fires. As you can see with my total down here, we have had almost 35,000 acres out of Mesa Verde National Park's 52,485 acres. So that's 66% of our park that's burned in recent memory. All right, so some of the things we do to protect our resources are to identify our fire sensitive sites ahead of time and get them prioritized for protection. And we use strategies like fuel thinning or prescribed burns to get some measure of protection before a fire even occurs. One example would be rock art that has vegetation growing right in front of it. If that vegetation isn't removed, it's much more prone to burning and spalling than if the vegetation is removed first. Our fire management crews, they also take measures to protect our historic buildings and our infrastructure here in the park headquarters area. Hose lays are staged ahead of time. We can wrap some of our fire sensitive sites with a material that looks like foil and helps protect it during a fire. We also give a briefing on our cultural resources to the wildland firefighting crews so that they know what these resources look like out on the ground ahead of time before they're out there on a fire. And then they can, if possible, go around a rubble mound, that type of thing, rather than go right through it. And one of the things that happens during the fire is our IC would request a resource advisor called a READ or REEF, which is Fireline Qualified, or a fire archaeologist. And their job is to protect those resources during the fire. They're going out with the fire crews and pointing out where the resources are and how to mitigate damage. So just a little more detail on that. A fire archaeologist does survey the ground ahead of wildland fire crews, if possible, and tries to recommend measures to minimize any impact. For example, digging a hand line around a rubble mound and trying to stay away from the midden area, which is where the artifacts are, and that type of thing. They're also mapping while they're out there, getting locations of known and unknown sites, taking photos, recording some basic notes, and then documenting damage that's happening during the fire itself. Okay, here's a few photos from that Moccasin Mesa fire that happened in 2018. As you can see, helicopters are used quite a bit on fires, and in the case of more remote fires, the archaeologist would be helicoptered out along with the fire crew to work on it. And then here's some pictures from our Moorfield fire, which happened just last year. This is one of our preservation crew members, Steve Mott, who gave a talk a few months ago. And that's him kneeling down and checking the number on the site stake. All of our sites are marked with some type of stake. Sometimes it's rebar or an aluminum stake, and they've got the number on there so that you can match where you are on the ground to where you are on the map. And that's what he's doing there. All right, well, this talks a bit about what happens after a fire. There's a few different phases that our landscape goes through for recovery. And one of the first things that happens while the fire is still going on is fire suppression repair. This would be happening in the mop-up phase of the fire, repairing hand lines. Dozer lines don't really occur here in the park. We recommend that bulldozers are not used because of the density of archaeological sites. You saw how many sites we had on that map. And so although bulldozers have been used in the past, we've got some old dozer lines from the 1970s, 80s. We do not do that anymore. Then we've got emergency stabilization, and we bring in BEAR teams, burned area emergency response teams. And this is a nationwide team. I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a minute, but they come in and do some things immediately to mitigate post-fire damage. And then we also have long-term recovery and restoration actions that take place in the years and decades following the fire. And that can be things like planting, reseeding with native vegetation, and that type of thing. All right, the BEAR team is a national team that's composed of specialists from different areas like archaeology, geology, hydrology, biology, and these specialists get together and work to prevent further damage to the resources that are in that burned area. So the cultural resource specialists on the BEAR team make it a priority to assess damage to any archaeological sites, any traditional cultural properties that are located there, and of course, historic structures. You're looking at our headquarters area here. You're looking at Spruce Tree House and the headquarters buildings. Some of these buildings date to the early part of the century, and our museum is located there as well. So for cultural resources, we want to record any impacts from fire itself and from suppression of the fire. And then we want to develop assessment and mitigation plans and get those into place as quickly as we can. So yes, it's really important to do this type of work right away while the vegetation is gone. Everything is exposed, which is good in one sense. You can see what's there, what was obscured before. We have found quite a few sites that way, especially check dam sites. Masonry that was down in the drainages was usually obscured by bushes. So after a fire, everything is apparent. But the downside of that is that it's exposed to erosion. All righty, so as I was talking about, you have a pretty big threat from erosion, and that does depend on the severity of the fire. We get all different types of fire in the park. Sometimes we're lucky and it's just a low severity fire that's kind of patchy and doesn't burn much stuff, but often it's a pretty severe fire. It burns all the stuff off the ground, the crowns of the trees. And when that happens, the soil becomes hydrophobic and it actually repels water. And so then when you've got a rain after a fire like that, the rain just washes across the mesa. We get sheet wash going on, and it really causes a lot of damage to the sites, to the masonry and the artifacts. And so those high intensity burned areas are definitely a priority for treatment. All right, here are some pictures of our site, Hemingway House, out on Moccasin Mesa. That fire burned in 2003, and then in September we had some heavy rains, and you can just see the water pouring over the edge of the alcove. Sometimes it runs along the back of the alcove too, and lands right on the architecture, and it really does a lot of, or can do a lot of damage to the architecture, as well as the area below the site, which tends to have a lot of refuse, a trash area that has a lot of artifacts, and retaining walls, walls that are built prehistorically to help hold everything in place. And those can get really damaged by this kind of rain event as well. All right, I talked about different types of burns, burn severity. Here's a moderate burn, our Moccasin Mesa fire. This is showing a part that was kind of patchy. And you can see a slurry drop there on the left side. And here's our Long Mesa fire. You can see how well a job, or how good of a job our fire crews did in protecting the buildings and the administrative area. We did have 2 houses burned down during that fire, but for the most part, everything was protected and saved. Here's a highly burned alcove. You just see how it thoroughly burned everything above and below the alcove. And here's an example of a highly burned surface site. Here's a few more examples of alcove sites. Down there in the bottom corner, we have Mushroom House. That site had pack rats living in it, and it had a very large pack rat midden inside that burned for days, and that site really got fried, unfortunately. But we did have good documentation of the site, and you know, it's still standing, so. Okay, this talks about, well, it's just basically a summary of our fires and the number of sites that were assessed after those fires. And I've got 2 numbers there under each fire: the number of known sites that we knew about and had been recorded before the fire occurred, and then the number of new sites that were just discovered during post-fire surveys. And as you can see, we have found quite a few new sites after our fires: 372 after that Chapin 5 fire, 221 after the Bircher fire, and so on. If you add them all up, we've got 688 new sites discovered during our post-fire surveys over the last 25 years. It's pretty impressive. So when we conduct a post-fire survey and an assessment, we go out and we do pedestrian survey. We can have anywhere from 1 crew to multiple crews. Sometimes there's 5 or more crews out there, depending on the size of the fire. And I should mention that some of these post-fire surveys do take multiple years to complete. We've lasted 3 or 4 years. And then after those sites are located and GPS, we do a complete site recording. We update all of the recording to modern standards. We've got a pretty substantial inventory form that's filled out, and that includes an artifact inventory. We also use GPS technology to create site maps. In the past, we were hand drawing these. We're using compass and tape. And we did have very accurate maps from those days, but now we've got GPS and we can locate all of our features spatially, which is really nice. Sheldon Baker is going to be talking more about that in a future talk. We also photograph the site, we document post-fire effects, and then we analyze what's going on, recommend treatments, and prioritize those. And then we do map any treatments that are installed right away. I mean, we map them whether they're installed right away or the following year, but we try to install those treatments as soon as possible. Okay, here is a map showing the Bircher and Pony fires specifically. Those are the ones that happened in the year 2000, and you can see how the Bircher fire did spread down onto Ute Mountain land. Some of it was also on BLM land and private land. And then the Pony fire was mostly on Ute land, but it did burn part of our park there on Wetherell Mesa. And we've got it broken down into burn severity. You can see that over almost 16,000 acres of the Bircher fire was a high severity burn. And Pony Fire was the same, 82% burn. I did some of the post-fire survey out there, and it felt like you were walking through a moonscape, just ash, walking through ash and trying to protect your eyes and ears and nose because you're breathing in ash all day. All righty, and then showing how many sites were treated, 441. And then of that, ideally, we'd like to go back and monitor every site that was treated, but that's not really feasible. We were able to monitor 100 of these sites. But all in all, 1,669 sites assessed on that project. Okay. Whoops. My screen is frozen here for some reason. Okay, well, bear with me for a second. Okay, there we go. Just decided to start working again. Okay, next I want to talk a little bit about fire effects and damage from the fire and from the suppression of the fire. We see a lot of smoke blackening and sooting of the masonry stone and the artifacts, also oxidation where it gets really red from the high heat during the fire, cracking and spalling. And then ash and mud splatter too, and you see a lot of that in our alcove sites as that water comes over the edge. Hazard trees are another problem. Burned trees that are standing in or right next to a structure, these have the potential to fall and bring up the root ball and displace masonry or do other damage in that process, or fall on a wall and knock it down. Also fire damage to artifacts, or even losing the artifact altogether, especially if that's wood. Wood beams that are present in standing structures, if these burn up, then we lose our potential to date them. Damage to rock art is another big one. And I've got a picture I'll be showing you in a little bit about what happened to one of our large rock art panels called Battleship Rock. And then we've got suppression activities. This has to do with handline construction, as I mentioned earlier, vehicles, staging areas, sometimes in the past have been partially on an archaeological site, nothing obvious, but there may have been some artifacts scattered around that weren't noticed. And then, of course, the post-fire erosion, the scouring and sheet wash. That's a really big one, and a lot of our treatments have to do with trying to alleviate that. Some more pictures for you. This is showing what Longhouse looked like after the Pony Fire. And here's some of our surface sites. The one down in the lower right is a square kiva in Moorfield Canyon. And here's that Battleship Rock panel I just mentioned. These photos show what it looked like before the fire and after the fire. And you can really see the oxidation that occurred there and the spalling. The rock just starts, some of it pops off during the fire and some of it continues to spall afterward. So the key with rock art like that is trying to keep the vegetation away from it and making sure it has good documentation in the event of a fire, so that at least we know what was there ahead of time. And we do what we can, but it is a large park with a lot of rock art scattered about. All right, here's New Firehouse, that's in Fuchs Canyon. This shows the water and ash damage that can occur when that vegetation is all burned off above the site. A lot of that black that you're seeing in the picture is just ash staining the walls as it comes down. Here's a similar situation at Little Hemingway House. This site is visible from across the canyon when you're near Balcony House. So this talks a bit about the historic structures that were damaged during the Long Mesa fire. We had 2 houses completely destroyed, another one damaged. Ash, soot, and smoke, the same things that are damaging the prehistoric resources, had impacts to our historic buildings. And then slurry is something I'm going to talk a little bit more about, the fire retardant that is used to stop the spread of the fire. It can do damage on these resources as well. And we had quite a bit of it used during the Long Mesa fire. You can see here 106,000 gallons of one type of slurry and 110,000 gallons of another type of slurry. Here's an aerial view where you can really see where the slurry drops were in our headquarters area and over Spruce Tree House. And Spruce Tree House had quite a bit of staining, as you'll see coming up here. There we go. This is showing the north tower of Spruce Tree House, and it was hit by the slurry because they're trying to protect it, which it did a great job of doing, but then we had to deal with all this red that ended up on the rocks afterward. One thing we did was install a silicone drip line above this site to help the ash and water from falling right on the rocks. This shows slurry impacts to some of our historic buildings. There is quite a bit on there, and it doesn't just wash off. It gets dry, and you don't want to chip it off and damage the stone. So there's a few different things that were tried, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the treatment section. Right now, I want to mention that we had some pretty cool post-fire discoveries after each one of these fires. This shows a few different artifacts that were found during post-fire surveys, as well as some fossils. And we've got some ceramics there, some projectile points, monometate, all kinds of things. This is a new rock art site that was discovered after one of our fires. This is out on Park Mesa. This site had petroglyphs and pictographs and different grinding slicks and things, both on the back of the alcove and on some boulders, but there wasn't any evidence that anyone had lived long-term in this alcove. They may have used it for temporary shelter, but this was previously unrecorded. And then here's a site that had been recorded, but it had some rock art down below the alcove that had not been recorded before. The site had been recorded in 1977, and then someone came along in '88 and took a picture of those pictographs, but we didn't have any information about it, so we recorded that. And then here are some artifacts that were found near Sunset House. We had yucca cordage, a paho, a batten that was probably used for weaving. So some pretty cool stuff turned up there. And then a hafted knife was found in one of our alcove sites. And it was at the back of the alcove. This alcove had been recorded and stabilized before, but its location was pretty well hidden at the back where you had to be on your hands and knees. So it hadn't been found before. And it was fully intact and complete with the cord around at the base of the handle there. We did do some blood residue analysis on it and found rabbit blood and human blood. Okay, now I'm going to talk a bit about the treatments that we install. We have different types of treatments here. We do a lot to try to combat that soil erosion that I was talking about, a lot of water treatment or watershed treatments. So these things I'll have pictures of. We use Excelsior matting, silt logs, and log diverters. And a lot of times the log diverters are just constructed with burned trees that are in the burn area. We also do removal of hazard trees. We try to do reseeding when possible to help the native vegetation come back and not just weeds. We've got a lot of invasive species that come in and thrive after fire. Examples of that are thistle and cheatgrass. So our alcove sites, we found out that you can install these silicone drip lines using silicone caulk along the alcove roof, and that really helps divert the water away from the architecture and off to the side. Sometimes we have to deal with some of the standing walls that are in danger of falling, and we can do some emergency stabilization to help shore them up until our stabilization crew can get out there and do something more substantial. And then slurry removal from the historic stone buildings. I'm going to have some pictures of that. And another form of treatment can be documentation, and that's what we try to do with threatened rock art or plaster, is at least get it recorded, even if we can't do much to protect it from degrading further. Although we do have things we do to help protect the plaster or keep it adhering a little longer. So here's some example of hazard trees. The picture on the right was just taken last year in the Moorfield burn area. And that's one of our archaeologists cutting down that tree. Here's an example of some of our silt logs or log diverters, I should say. And here is a log crib gate stabilizer. These are done in drainages that have a tendency to get the water flowing really fast, and there's usually check dams in these drainages, so we need to do something to slow down the flow so that it doesn't blow out the masonry that's still intact. And these have been proven to be really effective. All right, here's some examples of our silt logs. These are made of Excelsior, which is aspen shavings, and it's put in like a plastic netting, and then these are staked down, and our crews are really good at knowing what angle they need to be at and where they need to be placed above the threatened architecture. And so they have also been really effective. The one in the lower right is from the Moorfield fire, and it's protecting some check dams further downstream. You can see the view out to the canyon that's headed downslope. And so a lot of these treatments are done in the watershed above the architecture. Another form of treatment is stabilizing stump holes. These tend to be a threat too, because they create a hole and more water accumulation and rilling. And then burials that are encountered in burned areas need to be dealt with as well. And we try to preserve them in place. We don't excavate them, we just armor them with dirt and place some stone over the top to hold it in place. Here's some examples of Excelsior matting. This is used quite a bit. It's good at stabilizing the dirt and helping vegetation regrow, holding the water, especially when we can do reseeding at the same time. Here's an example down in School Section Canyon. And here's a pretty extreme example. I think this is the most Excelsior matting we've put in one single area, but this is a huge community center, a complex of quite a few sites with all kinds of room blocks and kivas. And it was being threatened. You can see the angle of the slope. So it was really important to get all these treatments in here and try to slow down that erosion and hold things in place. Here's an example of some of our maps, one of our older burned area maps from 1996, and a treatment as-built showing where all that Excelsior matting was placed, and log diverters, log grade stabilizers. Those are all overlaid over the site map. And in the 90s and the 2000s, we were doing those overlays by hand and digitizing them later. Nowadays, we're mapping on tablets, and we can just have different layers in the tablet. So we've got all the site information in various layers and a treatment layer. And this map here is showing a site from the Moorfield burn that was done last year and showing where that Excelsior matting was placed. So I mentioned these silicone drip lines. This shows you kind of the process that has to occur. We have to set up a whole rappelling system and rappel off the side of the cliff in order to install these. And usually 2 beads of silicone are applied. You apply one and wait for it to dry a bit and apply another one over the top. And so you've got to continually move across the face of the cliff while you're doing this. But it has proven to be really effective, and they stay on quite a long time. We have gone out to sites after a later burn and saw sometimes the drip line is hanging off or melted off. Sometimes it remained intact. But yeah, this method was put into place by one of our stabilization archaeologists back in the 1980s, and we've been using it off and on ever since. Here's another drip line that was put in at Little Hemingway House. I had a picture of that earlier with all the blackened ash coming down. You can see this treatment was put in, I think, 3 years after the fire. And so we can't always get to our treatments right away, but we get to them as soon as we can and when we can. All this is depending on funding and staff, etc. But you can see a lot of the black has already washed off, but damage was continuing to occur. So this was a way to alleviate that. And then this slide is talking about strategies to deal with that slurry, that red slurry that I showed you earlier. And various things were tried. What they ended up finding out was that brushing worked well, dry brushing or brushing with some water, not power washing, not sandblasting. And then the thing that worked best was using a 10% borax solution and using brushes with natural fibers. But it's really a process to get that slurry off the buildings. That had to be done very carefully by hand. Here's a picture of our historical architect at the time, Don Corbeil, and he had composed some of these slides for a presentation that he did after the fire. And they're trying some different methods there. And then we've got a picture of one of the members of the stabilization crew cleaning that slurry off with a brush. And we did use the stabilization crew for more sensitive buildings that had historical value, and some of the more modern buildings, we contracted a company to come in and clean that off. But it was best to do it as soon as we could after the fire. That slurry, it has salts in it, and the salts are what pose a problem to the sandstone, because they can cause stone deterioration through time. They cause something called efflorescence that kind of starts turning the sandstone to powder. And it's a similar thing that happens to the sandstone in the prehistoric structures in the alcoves with the ash. The ash helps or somehow causes more deterioration to the sandstone than just water hitting it. The ashy runoff causes the sandstone to kind of turn to powder at times. So we'll talk a little bit about monitoring. We have planned to, after fire, to do different phases of monitoring. And right after fire, we try to get through fairly quickly walk through and see how those erosion control treatments are working and do repairs if needed. We also, excuse me, we do check like treated versus untreated sites to see how the architecture is holding up, you know, how much better it fares with the treated sites. And also one of the things we take a look at are the artifacts and whether they're moving with the water. We definitely have seen quite a bit of movement taking place. Sometimes artifacts are several feet away from where they started. Sometimes they just disappear altogether. And we also take a look at how the vegetation is regrowing. Let's see, long-term monitoring, that's always a long-term goal, which sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't. We do have a challenge keeping up with that. We have a fairly small staff here, and there's a lot to keep up with. So we would like to reinstate our monitoring program. It's kind of fallen by the wayside in recent years, but it's really important. And so that's one of our goals here, looking to the future. So when we go out and monitor the effectiveness of treatments, we're looking at quite a few things. As I said, how the structures and artifacts are holding up, how much vegetation is coming back. Part of our documentation is taking photos, and we try to take photos in the same location. So here you're looking at Longhouse right after these mats were installed. And then here's a picture a little later. I'm not sure if, I think this might be 2 years later. And that's showing all the grass that's come back. Here we've got a few different photos from different fires, but you can really see vegetative regrowth coming, and usually it's coming back pretty good just a year later. In some of those more severe fires, it takes several years for the vegetation to come back. And as I stated earlier, sometimes the PJ does not come back. These log diverters and silt logs are doing a good job catching the silt behind them. You can especially see that in the lower right-hand corner, how it's catching the burned material and the burned soil behind there. Okay, this is my last slide. I just want to say thanks to all the Mesa Verde archaeologists who've worked on these fires over the years. It's been quite a big staff of people coming and going and doing work on the fire and after the fire, and we've had some really good people. Alrighty.
Well, thank you, Christine, so much.
Sure. Let's see.
This has been, I mean, I can't get over your images, and just especially one slide where it just showed the fire at full blaze in the park. I mean, that's scary.
Yes, yes.
And so were you involved in any of those fires, doing work on the ground, or you were there just for the post-burn part?
I both. So in the beginning, I got my red card. That's what when you get qualified, you go through the wildland firefighting course, and you have to take a physical fitness test. In this case, it's a pack test, which is arduous. You have to walk 3 miles in 45 minutes wearing a 45-pound pack, and and so they want to make sure that everybody out there is in good enough shape to do what they need to do out there, carrying all your line gear. I got my red card in 2000, and then that Bircher fire, the big one, happened in 2000, and that was pretty scary for me. And in that one, I chose to support from the office and helping the archaeologists who were out there figure out where the sites were and that type of thing, and working on maps and organizing paperwork and things. So that one, yeah, was kind of scary if you had not had any prior fire experience, as I did at that time. And then in 2002, I did work on the Long Mesa fire, and I went out with a hot shot crew, which was pretty challenging work. These are really, really fit, strong people who cover a lot of miles in one day. I think we did like 15 miles one day. I was beat, but yeah, it's yeah. But that was an exciting fire to work on, and we found some new sites. In fact, I was working with a crew where the scout who was putting in the handline route, he found a site that we didn't even know about before, and so he was really excited too. And yeah, it's fun to work with firefighters. Most of them get really engaged in what they're seeing and get excited about the resources.
Well, thank you, Christine. Well, we're going to open it up for questions and answers. If you have any questions or comments, please type it in the chat box, and we promise you we'll get to them. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, Christine, how many years would you anticipate, or from your experience, does it take for the vegetation to flourish again in a post-burn section?
Well, it does depend on the severity of the burn. I remember it took quite a bit longer for certain parts of the Pony Fire. Vegetation does come back, well, even a few months later, especially Gamble Oak. I remember going out like a month after a burn and seeing quite a bit of oak getting pretty high already, you know, a foot or two high. But it takes a lot longer for certain other native forbs and flowering plants. So it just depends, but certainly by the year after, you're usually seeing quite a bit of vegetation. But what we tend to see, especially if we don't do the reseeding, is that the invasives seem to sort of take over at first, and then they get squeezed out as the natives come back. So a few years later, we're definitely seeing good ground cover. It's the trees that is, I think, the most noticeable thing, especially when the visitors come through the park. They're looking at a burn and seeing all these burned trees, and then realizing that that burn may have been 20 years ago. And it's kind of surprising to some people.
Okay, well, thank you. We have a question from Nancy Nyberg. What was the cause of the 2020 Moorfield fire?
That was a lightning strike. Basically, all of these fires that I've talked about were caused by lightning.
Okay, and I think that speaks to a question for Mayor Lee Blair. She had asked what was the cause of fires in the park, so.
Right, yes.
Okay, and we have another question from Nancy Nyberg. Is desert varnish just aged fire debris / ash residue which washes over the cliff edge?
No, desert varnish occurs even in areas that have not been burned. It's usually from different minerals that are in the soil, iron and manganese and things like that.
Okay.
But we do get different staining. The more black staining tends to be from the ash.
I know that picture of where you see it coming over the ledge, it's just like, oh man, just so destructive on so many levels. But is that something that wears over time with weather, or you'll always see some kind of remnants of it?
Yeah, all of our alcoves have staining of some sort or another, you know, and the ash starts to disappear in the year or two after a fire.
Okay, but, we have a question from one of our fellows, Doug Bacon. He says, if I heard correctly, what is paho?
Oh, that's the term for a prayer stick. So it's usually a carved wooden stick that would have originally had feathers and things tied onto it. And then these were placed, say, in a niche or something in one of the kivas. Often they're found in different locations, but usually, yeah, the only remains we see are the wood stick, and the rest of it's deteriorated.
Great. We have a question from Jack Corbet. And he says, what has happened to the Mesa Verde, Monte Alban, Mexico, sister park agreement as that shared Mesa Verde firefighting expertise with the Mexican World Heritage Site? Monte Alban has a significant fire problem and a serious post-fire erosion.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't really heard that about Monte Alban and the fire. I'm not sure what the current state of our agreement is. I mean, as far as I know, we're still sister parks, but we haven't really, as far as cultural resources go, we haven't been collaborating in recent years. So that's a good question, and I'd have to follow up on that with the administration.
Yeah, that was interesting with the sister park agreement. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, it is.
Here's a question from Andre Jaffe. Is there a clear protective coating then that can be applied over rock art to protect it from future fires?
That's another good question. And I know we have experts who've been testing out different things. I don't know that they've found anything that actually adheres. So as far as I know, no, there isn't. And people who have been studying that have been doing a lot to document it, and especially in recent years with LiDAR scanning, they've been able to pick up a lot more imagery. But in terms of the protection itself, I haven't heard of something that actually stays on there when being applied, that doesn't do damage and that stays on the rock. But that's a good one to follow up on too. Thank you.
Yeah, I like that one too. Here's one for Marilee Blair. One additional question. I appreciate this one, so thank you for asking. Do Native American representatives go with you to see the newly found sites? Have any remains of humans been revealed by fires?
On our post-fire surveys, it's generally just the archaeology crews that are going out. We do consultations with Native American tribes, and we do have 26 affiliated tribes here at Mesa Verde. We do consult beforehand, and we talk about what to do if human remains are uncovered, and invariably they usually are, at least on the bigger fires, because they're common throughout the park, and so they would be revealed after a fire event, and then we have an agreement in place and follow the terms of that. If Native Americans do want to come visit certain sites, we welcome them to do that, and they have done that with us. More often, though, it's the cliff dwellings that are more accessible. We don't often have them coming way out in the backcountry with us. We have some pretty big hikes to a lot of our sites. Sometimes we've got to hike a couple of hours just to get there. So.
We have another comment, and I'll write down the information for you, Christine. I was a participant in the Mesa Verde Monte Alban discussions and agreement. Glad to put you in touch with the Mexican principals as they continue to have interest. Well,
okay, yeah, thanks. You can get me that contact information.
Yeah,
Thank
and you know what? I'm going to quickly, if it's okay with you, Christine, just put your NPS email in the chat box. Maybe that way you and Jack can connect.
Okay, great.
Let me quickly do that.
Oh, okay. Looks like Shannon.
I just did that for you, Monica. I was ready.
Oh, you're fast. Oh my goodness. Well, it's something because here we are talking about fires and lightning, and just since the start of the webinar here in Sedona, a storm has rolled in, and I've been watching, seeing the light flicker and everything.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Wow, is right. I'm gonna just leave the webinar open for another minute or so in case there's any additional questions. I think it's really interesting the work you do, Christine, because it's so pivotal for the whole conservation for Mesa Verde and the indigenous sites at the park. When I know initially when I thought of wildfires, you think of course, the landscape, the land, the animals, the birds, the vegetation. And even though I work in native arts, you know, that's not always at the forefront, the sites and everything. So this really opens up a new perspective to myself and probably a few of the viewers as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, post-fire archaeology is really interesting, and I had never done it before I worked here at Mesa Verde. And it was just really eye-opening to see what fire can do to sites, but also what we can do to protect them. And I've been impressed with how well our treatments work. And
well, thank you for your work.
thanks.
We have, I think, a comment from one of our other fellows on the board, Doug Bacon. And statistically, do the number of newly found sites indicate that there is one type of site that park archaeologists have overlooked more than another? You mentioned check dams due to their creek bed locations. Are there more basket maker sites, for example, that are found?
I would have to say that's definitely true of the water control features. As I mentioned earlier, we did find that they were a lot more extensive. We knew they were there, and we had quite a few check dam sites recorded, but we found so many more, especially after the Chapin 5 fire. They were showing up in just about every drainage. It was really impressive. Basket maker sites, I mean, we did find some after the fires, but I would say I think the proportion of basket maker to Pueblo 1 or Pueblo 2, Pueblo 3 was about the same. Basket maker sites here have a pretty subtle signature on the surface. They can be hard to find because the pit houses fill in, and sometimes the adobe melts away and there's just not a whole lot left on the surface. Sometimes all you're seeing is some burned rock, and it's very subtle. And then of course in a burned area, it's even harder to distinguish a culturally burned rock area from a natural burned rock area. You know, in a green area, when you see a burned rock concentration, and especially if there's a few artifacts in it, you know it's cultural, and it can be harder to make those distinctions in the burned areas. But that's where the artifacts are really important and other indicators of cultural activity. So I hope that answered the question.
It was extremely thorough. Thank you, Christine.
Okay, sure.
If no one else has any questions or comments, then I guess we're going to wrap this up. And Christine, I just want to thank you for, number one, your time and what you created today to share with us. It's so impressive. And the work you do is, like I said before, so instrumental. So thank you for being here with us and sharing your knowledge. I'm going to pass it back to Shannon. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. And it's very much a team effort. So thank you.
Thank you, Monica. I would just say thank you again for joining us. And of course, thanks to Christine and Monica for making this a possible webinar for us. I think the topic was very timely as we're looking at ash and soot and smoke that is kind of covering the whole western area of our country. So thanks again for joining and for your wonderful questions. And hopefully you'll take some of this with you as you experience some of the smoke and haze around your area. We hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.